Hello, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 3 of our book, The Mark of the Beast from Creation to Revelation. This chapter is entitled, They Came from the Nephilim, and I'm going to get into that in just a second here, but let's roll the intro and then come along if you're interested in finding out what They Came from the Nephilim actually means. All right, so this book, The Mark of the Beast from Creation to Revelation, is a book that we haven't released yet, but what we are going to do is by around the end of this month, maybe the beginning of February, we're going to put out the video course first, and then we're going to put out the book. Now, the video course is me basically reading the book, but then adding in little things that are personal that I'm adding in as we're speaking, getting a little more information or in-depth on the topic than what's actually going to be covered in the book. So we're doing that. We will be releasing this. It will be $175. There's going to be 18 or 19 chapters. I haven't decided if I'm going to add on another chapter about the rapture or not, but it's about 18 chapters. Each of these chapters is approximately a half an hour long in video length or longer, so it's going to be a pretty long series. So we're putting it out for $175, and we are then going to publish our book and an ebook for everybody. So if you're interested, if you want to get this, see all the content and information that's there, you can do that. We are advertising by giving you a few chapters for free. I've already shared one chapter. I don't remember which chapters that I have shared, but I'll be sharing this one, which is chapter 3, and I can share, I'll figure it out. But there's about 2 chapters out there right now already. So if you're interested and you want to know more, then you can shoot us an email because we don't have it for pre-sale on our website. You can shoot us an email saying you're interested, and we'll walk through the steps with you about how you can pre-order this. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the chapter here. They came from the Nephilim. Now, most people think that the Nephilim are the angels or the hybrid species of angel mixed with human being. And I do not believe that that is the case. I don't believe that the Nephilim are. Covered in this book is an entire chapter about who the Nephilim are, who the sons of God are, and so forth. And it's not what you think. And I don't give you anything from any external extra biblical sources. It's just what I see in the Bible in the original Hebrew context and even in the Greek. And you might even be surprised to find out that in this book, I will actually talk about how there has been an alteration of flesh from Genesis 3 all the way until the last chapter of the book of Revelation, and how the word alteration shows up in multiple languages and variances of languages throughout the Bible, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Greek. I guess that's basically the languages of the Bible, right? So these are things that are in the book. I'm just trying to give you, even we include the origin of dinosaurs, we talk about aliens, and we talk about technology that they had in the days of Nimrod, and where we can actually find in the Bible evidence of technology, evidence of futuristic technology, if you want to be fair, and that's even in Genesis chapter 11. I'll just give you a little hint if you want to go look for yourself and try and see what I saw. All right, now let's read the chapter. All right, so in the latter chapter, now, again, there's a prologue, chapter 1 and chapter 2. I'm reading to you from chapter 3. In the latter chapter, I briefly touched on the idea that hybrids were not the hybrid children of angels and humans, but were, in fact, the children of formerly righteous men who partook in the fleshly sin that the daughters of Adam were partaking in. So if you want to know about that, you're going to have to get the book, because there's something that happened in the Garden of Eden that is there in plain sight once you know what you're looking for. It's going to shock you, okay? Now, this is nothing new. Satan has been using this tactic of infiltrating mankind through women since the garden, since the beginning of time, basically. He's been using it throughout the Bible to get righteous men to sin against God. Balaam told the king to have his people's women marry the Israelite men so that they would sin and worship other gods following the women. And that was, as he told the king, how he would be able to curse Israel. And if you remember, Balaam said, "How can I curse what God has blessed?" And he looked for 21 different ways. He went to 7 different areas overlooking the camp of the Israelites, and he looked 3 different ways in each of those areas. So 7 times 3 is 21. 21 different ways that he could find an open door to put a curse on Israel through that open door. That's what demons do. You see that number 21 show up for related to demonic activity at least twice that I can see in the Bible. When I believe it was Michael, the angel, came to talk to Daniel, he said that he was wrestling with the principality or the ruler of Persia or whoever it was. I'd have to go back and read it specifically, for 21 days. So we see that 21 can represent rebellion, and it can represent curses. And so on the opposite side of that, it could represent obedience to God and blessing. But that is for another time. So he said to them, this is how you curse Israel. Satan used Saul to marry David to his daughter Michal, and I know it's pronounced Michael. It looks like Michal, and we want it to be Michal, but it's pronounced Michael, because she worshipped idols. And that word for idols, which I cover in the book also, is Rephaim, which we also see the word Rephaim used to describe the hybrid races in Genesis 14. Another little hint for you to go check out in the Bible and look up all those uses of the word Rephaim, and you'll get yourself an idea of who demons really are. All right? Now, anyway, the reason that he used Michal was because Michal used household idols, her household idols, that she had in her room where David slept with his wife, put it nicely, to create a kind of mannequin form or a bodily form under a blanket with a tuft of hair on it. So when the people came in to kill David, they came and stabbed the idols and were like, "What is this?" And she got away with it because she helped him escape. But that doesn't change the fact that she was worshiping idols. So Saul, that is the reason why Saul said, "Okay, I'll give him this daughter. I'll give him my daughter Michal." And he sends David out on this escapade and brings it back. He's married to Michal because he wanted to find a way to be able to kill or curse David. And it was hoping that her worshiping idols would lead him to worship idols, because that is an ancestral curse, or what do we call it? A bloodline curse. What do you call it? What is it called? Jesus, completely slipping my mind. But a curse that goes through your family bloodline. A familiar curse. I don't know. I can't remember. It's the simplest word we hear. Generational. It's a generational curse. That is a Hebrew generational curse. Because even from Rachel, she was sitting on her father Laban's household idols, that she claimed that she was having period, and so she couldn't get off her camel, so he couldn't check under her saddle for the idols. That's the same word, Rephaim, household idols. She worshipped idols. So there was idol worship all the way down the line. And then, of course, Solomon ended up worshiping idols at the end of his life because he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So naturally, they started to get to him and make him want to worship their gods. And that is what happens. And it's not because women are evil. It's because men are stupid sometimes. And that's all I have to say about that. It is one of the number one things that stops people from hearing the voice of God is getting involved with lust and sexual sin. That's all I'll say about that, because I'm about to do a lesson for that. So I'm often asked about, when I'm talking about the topic of the Nephilim and who they are, where they came from, etc., referring to Numbers 13:33. And what we see here in Numbers 13:33 is it appears to say that the descendants of Anak are the Nephilim. Nephilim or Nephilim. I say Nephilim, but it's probably just Nephilim. So it says, we even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak that come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we must have seemed the same to them. Now, as I studied the scripture to find the truth, I came across a very interesting revelation. There is a word in this passage that is not translated for some reason, But as I look at the word in Strong's Concordance number 854, I see that the word is actually translated as "and the" or "with" most of the time. All right. Now, this word denotes to be among. It denotes closeness in proximity. It doesn't denote that it is speaking about the person as a whole. It's talking about the proximity in relation to a person. So how close you are in a physical sense or physical distance. Now, with that word being translated, we get a better understanding that even the Hebrew people of Moses' time would have understood that the Nephilim were not the hybrid beings that were produced by the sons of God and the daughters of Adam, but they were separate beings. All right. Now, another word in this passage to take note of is the word "came from," which is, we translate it two words in English, but in Hebrew it's one word, and it's the word "min." And this word means among or from among. Okay, so this tells us that the Nephilim were among the descendants of Anak. So this gives us another proximal relationship word, okay? So the Nephilim were among the descendants of Anak, or the descendants of Anak were among the Nephilim, same thing, different wording, all right? They were among them. They were not from them as in a genealogical lineage. It is talking strictly about the proximity. So even if it was the word "with," then it was they were with and among them. They were not them, okay? Now, rereading this verse with these things in mind, what we see that it says in a more literal translation is, "We even saw the Nephilim with the descendants of Anak. Anak was among the Nephilim, and we, in our own sight, were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we looked the same in theirs." They actually say that twice. We in our own sight look like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we look the same in theirs. That's how they said it. It's not a typo. That is how they said it, okay? In Hebrew. They just repeated themselves. Now, after all of the research on demons, you may have already guessed that we found more than just the origin of demons, right? There are things hidden inside the Bible about the Rephaim that we simply miss if we don't go digging into the original Hebrew. And this is just one example. If we don't dig into this in Numbers 13:33, we wouldn't know that it's talking about being among or in proximity, right? So one thing that stood out to me when I originally started doing this research was that God didn't destroy every creature that existed. In fact, it very specifically says in Genesis 7:21 through 22, "And all flesh died and moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life. All that was on dry land died." Now, that includes the dinosaurs, which were part of a hybridization process that's being referred to in Genesis as the corruption of flesh. And we'll cover this more when I cover the genealogical line of Ham. That's in a later chapter. But this is to point out the origin of the hybrid Rephaim people, all right? The Rephaim people. And they were pre-flood Rephaim, and there was post-flood Rephaim. They had different types of origin, but they're still similarly called or similarly named. And Rephaim, which you know comes from the word Rapha. Rapha means to heal in Hebrew, but it also means to be sick, diseased, and forsaken. So the Rephaim in this sense would mean to be forsaken. They're forsaken ones. All right. Now, in Genesis 6:12, it doesn't say that all mankind had corrupted its flesh alone, but what it says in Hebrew is, "And so looked God upon the earth, for had corrupted all flesh, and their way upon the earth. Behold, Semech." I find it funny that they use the word Semech because the Semech is, when it's written out, they use the letter Semech as an ending, but when the word Semech is written out, it means branch. So I find that interesting that they should use that, and I'm not quite fully understanding the depth of why the Lord would have the angel tell Moses that, but I will figure it out, okay? Probably one of y'all will get the revelation and tell me, and that'll be awesome. So every single piece of flesh on the earth had been corrupted at this time, except for the remnant of humans that were pure and a handful of wild beasts that were saved on the ark. Today, They so desperately want to disprove the Bible and push their theory of evolution on the world that they disregard the scripture and say, why doesn't the Bible mention dinosaurs? Well, allow me to answer that question in the next chapter. Just a little something to whet your appetite, which I think I did put the origin of dinosaurs on YouTube, or at least on Rumble. So if you're interested in seeing that for free without having to spend $175 to get the whole course, or the whole video course, if you want to call it a course, the whole video version of this, then go look it up. All right. Now, the Canaanite people were well known for sleeping with animals. All right, that's a thing. That's what they did. Now, the ancient mythology of almost all of the ancient world religions speaks of their little g gods having children with animals and creating half-human hybrid children. Now, we claim that this is just nonsense and hogwash, and we dismiss it, yet the Bible clearly tells us that there were human beings that had beast-like features. Now, the very fact that God had to tell Israel not to have sex with animals is evidence that this was happening still at this time, right? Leviticus 18:23 through 24 states, "Nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It's perversion. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you." The word defiled here is el-tamia, all right? And it's part of one of the words you see in Genesis, which is tamim. And we see this in Genesis 6 in the accounting of Noah. Tamim in Genesis 6 means perfect, intact, pure, undefiled, and it's describing Noah's genetics. Now, in the passage from Leviticus 18, there's a word, al, which means no or not. Usually it's, I believe low is usually what it was. But el-tamia means not perfect, not pure, defiled, not intact, not whole, or unclean. Now, we can further understand this type of wholeness as referring to physical traits and attributes by researching the book of Leviticus, chapter 21. Verse 17 reads, "Speak unto Aaron, saying, Whosoever he be of thy seed in their generations that hath any blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God." And in Genesis 6:9, we see that Noah is blameless in his generations. Now, that word used for blameless is tamim. Okay? This word is a variant of the word mum. It's the plural, which is used to mean defect in Leviticus. The word mem, or mum, or however you say it, is the singular version of the word that is being used for tamim. Okay? Now, the word tamim is plural in Genesis. I am at the end of the Hebrew word makes it a plural word. Like Nephilim means there's more than one. I am at the end. Im, panim, Nephilim, etc. So we also see the word tamim in Hebrew regarding sacrificial animals as well. Okay, and that's the plural. It's talking about multiple defects. So for a human being, they're not allowed to make any sacrifices to God or approach the table of the showbread if they have any defect, any singular defect at all, which is a type of birth defect, right? And then we see that it's referring to all defects, period, for sacrificial animals. So this word tamim in regarding sacrificial animals refers to any physical genetic defect that an animal can be born with. And so by understanding that the pure and spotless sacrifice meant, understanding what it means shows us that Noah was pure and spotless in his genetics. So that's the same word that's being referenced here. It's talking about having no genetic abnormalities at all. So in the days of Noah, something had to happen that was creating genetic mutations that God considered blemishes, which we know are genetic markers or genetic mutations that would make someone unfit for sacrifice, because this word tamim is usually used to mean not fit or fit for something in a sacrificial type of way. It's usually used referencing your service to God, your worship to God, or sacrifice, okay? So, in the days of Noah, something was going on. And we know from the Bible, from Jesus, that the sacrifice that God was trying to preserve and was looking out for was the sacrifice of his son, the Lamb of God. So the reason that Satan was trying to corrupt all of the flesh on the planet was because if all of the flesh was corrupted, then there could be no sacrifice for mankind. There could be no bulls and lambs and goats sacrificed for mankind because nothing would be pure enough to atone for our sin. So God had to preserve the flesh, or else there would have been no chance for salvation for us, and Satan knew that. That's why when we read the book of Job, the first thing he attacks is Job's cattle, his livestock, because it takes away Job's ability to shed blood for forgiveness of sins, to create a hedge of protection around his family. And without that bloodshed, without that forgiveness of sins, it leaves a person open to attack, which is why the world struggles so much. They're open to attack from the enemy. They're basically in the grips of the enemy with God interceding. God intercedes and keeps us alive, but if you don't have Jesus, then it doesn't all work out for your good, So that's what this is talking about. So Satan and his demons were causing mankind to sin against animals and interbreed with animals, and causing other animals at the time to interbreed with other animal species as well, which is where we see dinosaurs coming from, essentially. And I will cover that if you go read the Origin of the Dinosaurs, which is actually the next chapter, chapter 4, you'll see that. All right. So they're causing them sin against animals. Actually, if you read the book of Enoch, it says that the angels led humans to sin against animals. That's what it's talking about. It's talking about having sex with animals. And our DNA at that time was so perfect that could still happen because God made us perfect. There came a point where we could no longer do that as human beings because we had bred so much that we created multiple defects and anomalies in our genetics, and not defects in the way that makes us not human. That's not the type that I'm talking about, but where we have so many differences that we simply can't do that anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that it's still impossible, because they're mixing animal DNA with human DNA now. They're mixing it with embryos. They actually there was an article in National Geographic that I saw John Paul was teaching about back in like 2012 or 2013 or 14, somewhere around there. They did an article about how they had successfully grew in a lab a horse-human hybrid that was a half-human, half-horse, that they had mixed the seeds together and forced them to come together, and they were creating a half-human, half-horse that was actually alive. And they claim that they terminated it because they felt like it was an ethics violation and they shouldn't have done something like that. Nevertheless, it has happened. They made a type of armor I saw in one National Geographic book where the armor was a mix of human flesh and spiderweb DNA. So DNA from a spiderweb. Apparently spiderwebs have their own DNA. And it made that flesh bulletproof to a 50 caliber bullet shot at point blank range. Bulletproof. So you can scientifically mix. And that's us just using knowledge and information, not with the genetic perfection that we had before we had all of these differences in our DNA from years and years of reproducing, and just our DNA shifting a little. When you make a copy of a copy, it says that Adam was a perfect copy of God, almost like basically a phantasm, which means like a perfect representation of God. But over the years, we kept breeding, and what happens is when you make a copy of a copy, and then you make a copy of that copy, and you keep making copies of copies, but never copying the original, you start to get little defects and irregularities, so to speak, in the copy that makes it so the copy will no longer be recognizable after some point. For example, when I worked at Target, I could not find the master copy of a order sheet that I needed. And I was making a copy of the order sheet, and after about 1,000 copies, it couldn't even be read anymore. It couldn't even be scanned. The lines got blurred and messed up and smudged somehow, and you couldn't even you couldn't use that copy to make copies. You couldn't use any of those copies of that copy because even though it had the form and you could make out the shape and even read the letters of the copy, you couldn't scan it because things were blurred. They weren't like they were originally. So I had to go back to the original, which is what we did with Jesus. We went back to the original, and we cover that, I think, even in this chapter also. So anyway, Satan and his demons were causing mankind to basically have sex with animals. God said that mating with any animal is what made the nations unclean, which means the word there is with lo tamim, meaning that they had genetic defects. It didn't just make them ceremonial unclean. It meant they had genetic defects. They had transformed or altered their DNA, which we do cover in this book. There's an entire chapter about the altered flesh. The altered flesh. In fact, the altered flesh was what was happening in the Genesis 14 as well, and it was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah as well. So you're probably thinking to yourself, like I just said, this is referring to ceremonially unclean people, right? But that can't be the only reason that God said, do not mate with animals, because mating is not just a word that means to have sex. It means to reproduce and have children or offspring with that. We'd think, oh, this is just ridiculous. This is just crazy. How could that can't happen? But it was happening. It was happening in biblical times. And even if they didn't have the technology that they had in the days of Nimrod, where they could actually alter DNA, where they were taking the blood, folks, the dinosaurs were alive when Noah built the ark. I know you're thinking, oh, this is crazy, ridiculous, creationist, and all this stuff. I don't care what you think, honestly. The Bible is the absolute truth of the Word of God, and in it is everything, every question, every answer to every question that you've ever had is within that, including where dinosaurs came from, where man came from, and what you should be doing in your future, right? So the dinosaurs were alive in Noah's time because the hybrids, but why do you think God was saving seven pairs, so 14, of every clean animal, and 2 pairs, 4, of every unclean animal? He wasn't just taking these animals on 2 by 2 and then they were just all reproducing from their own children. That's not what was happening. That is not. It was completely different than that. But anyway, these dinosaurs existed. So their bodies were on the earth, probably not even fully decomposed because it took a year. It took 1 full year for the flood to stop. Right? It took a while. Then the ark set down. The bodies of these creatures would have still been on the earth at that time. And they found viable DNA from supposedly a 65 million year old fossil of a dinosaur that shouldn't be there. Because after, I believe it's like 10,000 to 100,000 years or something like that, DNA should no longer be able to be looked at in dried up blood. Do you understand what I'm saying? And there's multiple instances of this. Well, we see examples of these beast-human hybrids found in Genesis 14. And in this chapter, we see the word Hazuzim. The word Hazuzim is used to describe one of the tribes of Rephaim described in Genesis 14, verse 5. And this word originates from the word Ziz, which means beast, or it can mean abundance. So these were beast hybrids, which means that they were part animal. They lived in the land of Ham, which we know is the land of Canaan, and the Canaanites were what? Nephilim. All right? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that I found scripture in the Bible that correlates to all of this information, and I'm laying a foundation for a revelation that will change your entire outlook on your end times doctrine from here forward. I promise you of that. So let's take a look at Genesis 4:26. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began man to call upon the name of the Lord. And people read that at face value. It looks like it's straightforward, saying, after 238 years, if you did the math, men finally started to commune with God again. But that's not the case, because that very same chapter, we learned that it's not the case. If humankind was not talking to God, was not being righteous, wasn't listening to his word, wasn't performing his will, then the prior verse in this chapter where Cain and Abel were bringing offerings to the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Cain, would be contradicting that very verse. And whoever wrote Genesis, which was Moses writing down what an angel told him, would be contradicting themselves, and that would render the entire story moot. Moot, all of it wrong. What we see when we dig into the meat of this verse, in verse 26, is there is a story of the origin of what would become known as the men of renown in Genesis 6:4. So, let's look at the name Enosh or Enos. Enosh means humankind. This is not a coincidence. God used names throughout the Bible to paint a picture of what was going to be done in certain times. Okay. The next word we need to look at is the word Huhal. This word is translated as men began to, all right? But when you read the Strong's definition, it means to defile, to bore, to pierce, to profane, to begin, as in opening something with a wedge. So you're starting to create a wedge. To pollute, to wound, to cut with a sword or a knife, again representing something was happening where something was being wounded or damaged somehow. All right. These various meanings give us a great understanding that shows us how they began to profane something. Okay. Now, the word profane, a lot of times we don't understand what's actually being said because we don't understand the origin of the word or what a word actually means. The word profane derives from the Latin word profanus, which means outside the temple. All right. Now, this paints a picture for us that indicates that not only were they irreverent towards the name of God, but they defiled and polluted something outside the temple of God. And it's my speculation that they profaned the outside image of the temple, that image being the glory of God or the appearance of man that was created after the image of God. Okay, the next word that we look at here is the word likro, which is Strong's 7121, and this word means to call upon, but that's only the surface of understanding of this word. Strong's defines it also as to bewray oneself, and upon looking up the meaning of the word bewray, we find that the word means to speak ill of someone, to divulge something, and it originates from the Hebrew kara, which has a wide variety of applications. Now, used in tandem with likro, meaning to bewray, we're able to ascertain the proper meaning of the likro, which means to aggressively challenge or defy somebody. All right. The next thing that we need to understand is the word bashem, which means the name. Ba is a prefix that can mean of, when, in, coming, to come, in, that, etc. Okay. It's a very versatile prefix. And now Shem is defined by Strong's as name, a mark, renown, memorial, a conspicuous position, or an appellation. All right, now we see something remarkably similar to this in the book of Revelation when it speaks of the mark of the name, that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. That's Revelation 13:17, okay? Now we have two words to pay attention to in this verse, chargama and onomos, mark and name. Chargama is as close a word as you can get to the word hallel in the Old Testament. It means to engrave, stamp, cut, or carve. Pretty interesting, isn't it? And the purpose of this is to reshape an object in such a way that it bears the likeness of something or someone. So that's what the chargama is referring to. It's like making a stamp of something, essentially. That's what the mark is. It's not just they cut you or something. There's a transformation or alteration that's happening here. Now, the best example of this in today's world is how we engrave an image on a coin. It starts as a plain piece of metal, then it's engraved and takes on the shape, characteristics, and or form of the image that it was crafted to look like. For example, an American quarter starts as a piece of silver metal. I don't know what kind of metal it is anymore. It's not silver anymore. Maybe it's like, I forget. It's something. It's like some kind of like nickel or something. I don't know. It's not even that. It's not even a real metal. But then they heat it up and they stamp it with a picture of George Washington. Okay. Now that quarter bears the image or mark of America and the image or mark of the likeness of George Washington. So here we have likeness and image. Interesting. And its value. It has a number. So we also see the word onomos, which bears a striking resemblance to the word Shem in Hebrew. In this case, onomos means name, character, fame, and reputation. Now stick with me. It's all important to understand the origin of demons. The Hebrew mindset of the time was that a person's name was inseparable from who they are as a person. For example, in America, we see the name King David. We see a title, and then we see a name. But David means one who loves or one who is beloved. The Hebrew mind would see king who loves or king who is loved. The name not only identifies who a person is, it identifies their characteristics and physical and spiritual traits as well. So, for example, King David is called ruddy. Ruddy means red. It's noted that King David had red hair. Esau was said to be born covered in hair and was that it was as thick as a carpet, and he was red all over, so they called him ruddy as well. So we see here Esau, however you say it, was a redhead. And this was not an uncommon trait in the days after Noah's flood. In fact, they have discovered that some of the first pharaohs of Egypt had red hair, blonde hair, and blue or green eyes and Caucasian skin. All right. Now, just this century, the remains of a mummy were discovered in 1903, which were identified as the Queen Hatshepsut. Her later ancestor, King Ramses, also had red hair. Now, if you remember the bust of Hatshepsut was rather European-looking female. Her ancestor, King Ramses, whose body was on display, I believe, in England, had red hair. And so they did a DNA test on Ramses and confirmed that the root of the DNA was that he was a naturally born redhead. So it should be noted that Ramses did dye his hair in his old age, but nevertheless, it doesn't take away the fact that they could determine that he was a natural redhead, a ginger. All right. Now, the reason that I'm pointing this out is simply to validate that red hair was not an anomaly uncommon to the Middle Eastern regions in Africa. And we're going to cover that more in the technology of Nimrod in the next chapter, or the next couple of chapters. Now, getting back on track, when you look at Genesis 4, you see that same mark of the beast was very subtly mentioned when they stated men began to call on the name of God. What it says in Hebrew is they began to cut and pollute the image, mark, or memorial of God and profane the outside of the temple. And this is the earliest known reference of the mark of the beast in the Bible. Now, we see this in subtle ways happening throughout the Bible as a mockery of God. And what I mean by this is that when an invading army would take over Jerusalem, they would sacrifice unclean animals in the temple. They would pollute or profane the temple with the blood of the animal that was not acceptable to the Lord. And this was a type of foreshadowing of the pollution of the human body with animal blood. Now, after all, our bodies are the temple of the Lord. So if we profaned the outside of the temple of the Lord, what was being profaned in Genesis chapter 4? So let's take a jump to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterwards as well, when the sons of God had relations with the daughters of men, and they bore them children who became the mighty men of old, men of renown. That's the New International Version, which I don't particularly care for, but it says it pretty well. The key word that we have to look at, gives us the biggest clue that's hidden in plain sight. And that word we need to study is the word lahem, which is not translated in here. For whatever reason, it's not translated in the English translation. And this is a peculiar word that doesn't make it into the English translation. It means to wound. Again, something wounding. It means to swallow greedily, to burn, or to rankle. Now, I had never heard of the word rankle, and I do see the pattern between to wound or to swallow up or to burn. So this implies that there's some sort of wounding or defect of some sort that's considered a defect which would make somebody unclean, as we learned from what I previously shared in this chapter, right? But the word rankle really stood out to me. What does rankle mean? Now, I like to study the origin of words, the etymology of a word. The word rankle, when we do the word study, has quite the etymology, and rankle comes from a Middle English word, from an Old French word, rancleur. Now, the word rancleur, this word derived its origins from an alteration of a medieval Latin word, dracanulus, which is the diminutive of the Latin word Draco, or serpent. This is not a coincidence that God allowed this word to be one of the definitions of that word, of lahem, okay? And it's not lachem, meaning bread, it's lahem in a completely different word, all right? Now, we see the word Draco or serpent. So if we reread the tail end of that part of Genesis 6:4, it says, the sons of God came into the daughters of Adam. They bore them serpents who were wounded, who were impure, who were not fit to be used as a sacrifice, who had genetic defects or alterations. Those are the mighty ones, the Gibborim, the men of the name, image, mark, or renown that profaned or polluted the outside of God's temple. Okay, well, that wraps up that chapter. It's an awful lot for you to take in, right? That is a lot of information. Now, if you are interested in purchasing this video course, we're putting out the video course before the book. You can send us an email because we don't have it up for pre-sale on our website yet. We like to get it all recorded before we put it up for pre-sale because we want to be able to edit it and also everything else. So it's going to be $175 for the whole course. It should be 19 chapters. As you can tell, this chapter is 40 minutes long. The majority of the chapters are half an hour. A couple of them are about 15 minutes. But for the most part, they're very long. So you'll be watching this for a long time. It will probably take you binge watching it over a week. We'll then be putting out the book, but in order for us to publish the book, we have to have the finances to publish the book. And right now, that's not something that we can do, right? Things have been tight. The longer Joe Biden's in office, the tighter it seems to get, right? So, but if anybody wants to sponsor the book and pay to have the book published, then we will get it published ASAP, within a month or two. We already have a publisher on board, and an editor, and everything else. I've already created the picture for it and everything, okay? So, shoot us an email, firesidegrace@yahoo.com, if you're interested in purchasing the course. We will inform you of how to do that and what we need from you, and that should be it. There's going to be a lot more like this, and if this has whetted your appetite, then I look forward to sharing the rest of the revelation in this book with you, and it covers a lot, much more in depth than even that chapter was. Until next time, see you guys.